Aloha and welcome to another of ThinkTech Hawaii's Point Counterpoint programs. And my name is John Waihe'e, and I will be hosting this program for ThinkTech. We have four great guests with us this afternoon. We are going to be discussing the European conflicts in 2024. And joining us, we have Professor Jean Rosenfield was from the UCLA. And we have Carl Baker, who is an advisor to the Pacific Forum, senior advisor, by the way. And we also have Upmati Kandekar, who is a geopolitical analyst. And joining us all the way from Spain, University of Hawaii, Professor Daphne Dessler, who will tell us a little bit about the English and Jewish identity and all of those great things. So I'm going to let everybody kind of get into the mix, introduce themselves, and we'll get right into discussing what's happening in the Ukraine and what's happening with the in Israel. Start off with you, Gene. Tell us a little bit about what it's like to be a professor from the university. I've got to see what UCLA stands for. So much easier. It's just a tongue twister for me. Go ahead.
I am a historian of religions, formerly academic researcher at the Center for the Study of Religion at UCLA and lecturer at UC Riverside and UCLA. My field is religion and conflict. I have studied terrorism, and my field is a social science field. So we analyze religion and how it relates to conflict and individual motivations.
Thank you, Gene. Carl, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, Carl Baker. I'm a senior advisor, as John said, mostly senior because I'm old, I suppose, at Pacific Forum. Prior to that, I was a military officer for 30 years, and I've been here for about 20 years. And we're a think tank in Honolulu, and we look at Asia Pacific primarily, but we've been looking at Ukraine also because it is an important issue that affects all the world.
Umati, what's
Aloha,
it like to be a global analyst?
Aloha. My name is Rupmati Khandekar, and I have done my PhD and research degrees on international organizations. And having worked with the United Nations, the European Union delegation to India, I have just focused on researching, and writing books, researching. So it's something I've become passionate about, and it's lovely to be on the show with you guys.
Daphne, let the people know what's it like to be at the University of Hawaii.
It's very busy these days, but I'm here not to represent the University of Hawaii at Manoa, but myself as an individual. I am a member of the English department because I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a historian, but I look at Jewish identity from the lenses of rhetoric, memoir, biography, and autobiography, and Jewish identity. And so it's from those vantage points that I'll be speaking to you today.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon and participating in this very important show. Now, the conflict in Ukraine has been going on for about 2 years. And I'm sure that, Putin didn't just wake up one morning and says, I'm going to invade Ukraine. So, Gene, why don't you give us a little bit about the background of that conflict and what are some of the ramifications from your point of view?
Well, the conflict between Ukraine and Russia is almost to some extent like a conflict between brothers because the mythology that animates Putin is the mythology of the three brothers, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. Presumably, from Russia's point of view, it is the elder brother, although the origin of Russia really took place in Kiev on the Dnieper River when the Swedes came down and established a trading post there that they then defended militarily. So that's irrelevant because Putin is acting out of a desire to restore Russian civilization, basically from Vladivostok to Dublin. And we have to understand the philosophy of Eurasianism, which is a neo-fascist philosophy that animates a party in Russia that runs Russia. And this essentially means taking back what they believe is historical Russia, including Ukraine, the second largest country in Europe, and the breadbasket of Europe, the breadbasket to Africa as well. So control of the Black Sea is very important to allow foodstuffs that are raised in Ukraine to be transported to the rest of the world. Now,
Go ahead. Sorry.
Ukraine,
No, sorry. I want to know a little bit more about what this historically means. I mean, are you talking about restoring the Soviet Union again, or what?
no,
What? He's just some big bully, or how does this all work?
Putin was a KGB officer in East Germany when the wall fell, and he was appalled by Russia losing the territory it had gained after World War II. He looks back to the Battle of Poltava in 1709, in which Russia became the dominant power in Europe because it defeated Sweden at that battle. Sweden was really trying to invade Russia. And so he feels very defensive about losing the satellites. And as you may have noticed, since 2014, he has been trying to gain territory. In fact, Ukraine is almost surrounded by Russian-controlled territory, including in Moldova. They have a strip of land next to the Ukrainian border. And it's quite obvious that he wants to absorb Ukraine. And for those Ukrainians who do not want to be absorbed by Russia, presumably there is a plan to get rid of them. So we may be looking at a takeover of Ukraine, which would include some mass killings or deportations in a Stalinist way. But Putin is very big on the Orthodox Church, on Russian civilization, on deposing America from its role in the world by establishing a new world order in which our currency will no longer be the dominant currency. He will have control over Europe, maybe through means of energy control, and the United States will become an isolationist state, and the globe will look to
Wow.
Russia.
So, Carl, jump in on that. What are the policy implications of all of this for us? I mean, for America, for the world?
Yeah, Gene is painting the larger picture of what could potentially happen, I think. But to put it back into what's happening today in sort of policy terms is, I think, important to understand, because I think we are at a bit of a crossroads. Essentially, I think the situation on the ground is there is a ground stalemate. And it's similar to what happened in Korea from 1950, in the late 1950 to 1952, where there's a bit of jockeying between the two, but there's no real territorial advances anymore. Russia has taken the eastern side of Ukraine. It's taken Crimea, and it's basically moved its borders closer to the Dnipro River than it was 2 years ago. But the fact is that, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was going to say, given what you just described, though, is there any chance that the Ukraine could actually win the war?
Well, I mean, that's the real policy discussion, and that's why we're at a bit of a crossroads. Is what does win the war mean? You know, for Vladimir Zelensky, winning the war means taking back all the territory that Russia has taken since 2014. You know, and that, I think, is becoming more and more unrealistic given the ground stalemate, because that was the intent of the 2023 counteroffensive that he put together. But the fact is that there's a number of reasons why, but the fact is that the Russians are fairly well dug in, and so it's going to be very difficult to move that territorial zone now back to where those original borders were. So if you mean is Ukraine in a position to win back all the territory, I think it's going to be very difficult. And I think the real policy issue today is what does winning mean?
What does winning
Ukraine?
mean for Putin?
Well, I mean, if you take Gene's line, the winning means taking Ukraine first and then marching on to Dublin. I think for Putin in at least the midterm is to eliminate Ukraine as a state.
Gene, you know what's interesting is that there's some conversation now that there's Ukraine would not be able to exist in the fight without the support from the United States and without aid. And yet, initially there was an awful lot of support from the United States Congress going to the Ukrainian fight, and yet today the same enthusiasm doesn't exist, and the opposition to or the isolationist tendencies in the Congress seem to be driven by at least religious, I think, somewhat of a religious concern, and that is that during the Cold War, communism was, the enemy of Christianity. It was, and there was this connection that the left and the and anti-Christianity was together, and yet today that there's still this paranoia about what's left. I don't know what that means that's not the discussion with some of the fundamentalist religious groups in the country. But it seems to me anything that used to be communist, and yet why is it that all of a sudden Putin doesn't seem to be, and Russia, at least in my opinion, doesn't seem to be as much of an enemy to at least the religious right of in the United States?
The social issues in Russia mirror the social issues for MAGA. They're anti-homosexual. They are pro-family, pro-religion. They are anti-matriarchy. They are pro-patriarchy. So on very basic issues, there are similarities there. But there's something greater. There is the tendency to authoritarianism, which is a worldwide trend today. And one of the reasons for that is that nationalism is replacing a general global view. And we have religious nationalism here that undergirds MAGA and the Trump movement. In Russia, they have religious nationalism that undergirds restoring Russian civilization over the Eurasian continent and Orthodox Christianity. So these are motivations which build loyalty to a supreme leader who's a father figure. And both Putin and Trump have a lot of psychological and sociological parallels in their means to power. Power is the major thing because in power, you can exercise control over how people live their lives. And this is something that the extreme Christian nationalists in the United States and the extreme Putin nationalists and Eurasianists have in common.
Well, let's just so that doesn't sound like we're picking on only one of the cousins. Let's go to Rumati and talk about some of the underlying aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. We give the Muslims and Jewish people the chance to express their participation in this situation. Tell us a little bit about what's happening in the Middle East.
Yeah, so headlines, Israel was hitting headlines, Israel, Palestine, but what happened on October 7th was unprecedented when you saw Hamas, which is an Islamist resistance movement, put up a terror attack on Israel, which was so unprecedented that 1,200 people were slaughtered, murdered, picked up from their homes, and it gave the world such a what is that? It was just catastrophic to see such anti-Semitic sentiments come out in the open. And the thing about this was 250 people were taken hostage. And, notions like sovereignty, right to self-defense, everything was brought into question in international politics. And the Israeli right to self-defense was resisted to such a point that Israel had to give a warning of 20 days to evacuate Gaza Strip from where the terrorists had come in to attack a nation. They did that, but then they were questioned all over social media. It was propaganda at its best by the other side. Hamas was going to be portrayed as the victim when in fact it was the attacker, isn't it? And this way, Israel had to face Gaza, Hamas leaders behind a shield of people, civilians. And when the civilians were being killed, Israel was being bad picked for their tactics. And, it was splashed all over international media. International organizations like the United Nations refused to take Hamas by name. They refused to, have ICJ. The South Africa took Israel to ICJ over the issue of genocide. They, Hamas is a Islamist resistance movement, which was picking out the slogan of "Free Palestine from the river to the sea." This was wiping out Israel off the map. They were talking genocide when Israel was itself tried for genocide. And these things kept on coming in international media. And it's an ongoing conflict. The repercussions are still on because we still have hostages, 250 hostages on the other side. You have anti-Jewish sentiments seen on every street in the world. There are people who are half knowledgeable about this, but still they have a very strong voice against Israel. So that
Does Putin support Hamas?
yes.
I mean, how does Russia get into all of this and Russian Orthodoxy?
For sure, when Putin opened up this Ukrainian war, it gave Iran a chance to bring in $100 billion of by selling their oil. They were restricted by sanctions, but through the Ukraine Russia war, when Russia opened up and de-dollarized the system, Iran got this funding, massive funding. They were a starving economy. They got massive funding. That funding they diverted towards Hamas, and Hamas got a chance to put this money into slaughtering Israeli people. Otherwise, such a attack would have never taken place. And Israel is the only democratic state in the Middle East. That's why it's very, very delicate and surrounded by 6 antagonistic states on each side, ready to pounce on it. So the allies have to come across the seas to help.
So Rumati talked about the fact that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And yet South Africa filed a lawsuit in the International Court of Justice alleging that there were atrocities and war crimes perpetuated on the Palestinian people, not only during this particular period, but even earlier. So definitely, how does this all come together?
We have some would say a movement towards a new world order, with the EU, Europe forging ahead as a political power. It has been called into action by aggression on both sides. So you have Russia as an aggressor, you have Israel under attack, and in both cases, we actually see, despite what people might see on social media and public opinion, Europe coming in strong in support of Ukraine in terms of military support and also in terms of providing military support to Israel. So we have a distinction to be made between the actions of leadership, in which Europe is forging ahead as a force to be reckoned with, and has come in support of both Israel and Ukraine in ways that Israel has not seen before, and in ways that have not been necessary before. So we see Europe taking a formidable role, and that I think is probably a good thing for both Ukraine and Israel.
You know, it's interesting because it seems that not specifically on the war, but as we were discussing earlier by Romonte, that there seems to be a kind of anti-Semitism
Yes.
that is coming out again. I mean, raising its ugly head. It seems to do that every so often anyway, but especially now, uh, internationally. Um, and that seems to be, at the same time, we also seem to see this continuation, at least in parts of the world, of the anti-Muslim uh, type of feelings. Now, how does that all? This seems to be a real, very complex. How does that all kind of fit together? I mean, I'm sure they play off of each other, but what are the roots of it? Why are people at the University of Hawaii going around saying that Israel is actually trying to Judaize Palestine?
But we have a long history of these three world religions vying for power: political, economic, and social power. I'm currently in Spain teaching abroad, and that's marked in the streets and in the architecture and in the, famous mosques having cathedrals being built right in the middle of them. So the fact that political and religious power have not always been separated means that when you have battles over land and power, and you have theocracies at work, you're going to have the three world religions the three Western religions, uh, uh, at war with one another, essentially being manipulated in these various ways by various world leaders. So that, I think, is a good beginning point. Um, from the Jewish vantage point, which is my own, my own great grandfather had to leave Odessa, which is part of Ukraine, because of pogroms. And then, of course, Israel. And then he actually fled from Odessa to pre-state Israel, to Tel Aviv in the 1920s. The Jewish story has always been one of attempting escape and survival wherever it could be done, um, and is considered one of the oldest forms of discrimination, um, centuries old. And so, whatever happens at the University of Hawaii is not unique to this particular time, place, or period.
But how effective the internet would be an institution like the international, and this is for anybody, International Court of Justice to deal with things like anti-Semitism, and the atrocities that we now see in war, not only in the Israeli Hamas conflict, which obviously occurred, but also in the Ukraine. I mean, what's happening to our civilization? Maybe Gene, you can jump into some of this.
Yes, I'm personally researching the answer to that question now. I don't have the answers, but there is, as I said before, a global trend of authoritarianism. It has taken over the primary ideological conflict of the time from religious terrorism. That wave is kind of exhausted itself. And what we're having now are aggressive states that are developing religious bases for their superiority and and we're seeing aggression, national aggression. So what we're seeing in terms of war, and Carl can speak to this even better, is a return to the type of warfare we saw in World War II. And in terms of great powers vying for a new world order, and exacerbating conflicts in proxy states like Iran and Israel and Ukraine, is an attempt to become a global power, a supreme power. And this really amounts to a return of neo-fascism. But the conditions of the military on the ground in Ukraine right now, as Carl has said, are at an extreme point. And there has just been a replacement of top generals owing to the concern about the lack of ammunition and manpower in Ukraine relative to Russia and what this means in the long term. And I think Carl can speak to that.
Yeah, why don't you jump in this, Carl? And
Yeah, I mean, there is this important underlying theme about religion and long historical trends. But in practical policy terms, again, what Gene is talking about is sort of this breakdown of post 1945, where when Russia invaded Ukraine, a sovereign state, this sort of broke the norm. And I think that this is an important point to recognize, is that once you break that norm, then things do start falling apart, and the international institutions that we've built are no longer adequate to address some of these problems. So to get to your question about the ICJ, yeah, the ICJ can investigate genocide, but when you're breaking norms, that seems much less important than it did 10 years ago when everyone was still abiding by the norms of sovereignty. And I think what's happened now in the rest of the world is that the rest of the world is watching this, and they're watching these narratives, and the narrative that we've tried to build around democracy as this is a defense of democracy becomes less resonant, doesn't resonate as well as it would if we were talking about the breaking of the norm of sovereignty. So in other words, what's happened now is Russia has broken the norm, and it has played well in the rest of the world. So China, India, others in the so-called global South are looking at the opportunities that the invasion has given them to de-dollarize the international economy, to find new outlets for resources coming out of Russia, and basically developing a whole new trade network that excludes the West. That while the European Union and the United States are trying to defend Ukraine and Israel, the fact is that Russia is building a new network through China and others in the world, at which ultimately become a challenge to the norms and institutions that were built post 1945.
wow, that's a great place to take a break. And we're about ready to do that because we want to come back and apply what you just said, Carl, to the situation, in geopolitical terms of what's happening in Israel. That this may not be simply a question of terrorists versus their neighbors. This may be something much deeper in the Middle East as well as the Ukraine. So with that in mind, we are going to take a short break and come back in about a minute. Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii and our Counterpoint discussion on the European Conflicts 2024 and the implications for the world and for our country. When we left this, Carl was actually expressing the point of view that the invasion of the Ukraine actually afforded totalitarianism or totalitarian regimes the opportunity to actually create an alliance against Europe and against the United States, or some kind of how does that work in terms of the Middle East, Romati. I mean, Middle East and India and what we call the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah. This ICJ, continuing on the ICJ judgment, you see, it's an organ of the United Nations, and it has decisions which are non-binding. And so these are just guidelines. They serve as guidelines. So we don't have a supervisory authority in the international system as such. So these conflicts thrive and they continue over years. Now we are seeing over years that these conflicts are continuing. They will term somebody a war criminal. They will say this is genocide, but nothing is being done. And at the helm of it, when the Secretary General himself refuses to take the term Hamas in the resolutions, you see the veto power of America becomes very important for Israel in the Middle East, because this what happened in I'm talking about Israel. Hamas conflict. For Israel, it's an existential crisis. It's not an issue of land or anything. It is about their existence tomorrow and the repeat of this terror attack again. So that's why, everybody has to take a stand that when you have terrorist attacks, the right for a country to self defend, it was not mentioned in the ICJ judgment. So, how can you give credibility to such an organization? And when it's the only supranational, intergovernmental organization the world has at its disposal, and still we have no, impartial judgments, it's difficult to trust international institutions. And so, countries are acting in their own right, and these conflicts do take place without supervision.
Yeah. So,
We lack supervising authority.
well, given that situation, which is, you start off thinking of the struggles in Palestine as between two groups, but actually it seems to be spreading throughout. You have, I mean, you have countries that the denials seem almost like a confession. Where at least to me, where Iran says, "Well, we're not doing this, or we're not doing that," and yet it's hard to think that the situation could exist without some kind of broader support. And yet, what binds all of these things together? I mean, what binds it? It seems like and that's a question really for Daphne. I mean, what, why is Israel so unpopular with its neighbors that we have this situation, and yet the Israeli cause seems to be a righteous one? What's the what's at play here?
I, it reminds me of a question when I teach. I teach a film and literature of the Holocaust, and we're in Spain right now. So begin with 1492 and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and it reminds the students that the Jewish people there had to wear either red or yellow cloth to designate themselves as Jews. Eventually, there's a decision made that they should be just expelled altogether, so there can be a Catholic hegemonic power, so essentially theocracy. And the students almost always ask the same thing: Why do they hate the Jews so much? Why? As kind of just a precursor, right? I tried to give a precursor to the Shoah, to the Holocaust. If you have the expulsion in 1492 of Jews, then you have the reemergence of the Yellow Star as a kind of way of marking people who otherwise might be able to pass. And there's sort of this fascination with the other, with people who refuse to recognize Christ, people who refuse to recognize Muhammad, people who are different, people of different traditions, people who maintain a sense of community and a commitment to their belief and language and culture. In various times have seen to be some sort of political threat to that hegemonic power. So we see that again since I'm teaching in Spain in Franco's regime, that he would also sort of position the Jewish people as a potential threat fascism in Spain. How realistic that threat was is probably not in keeping with the with the alarms that he attempted to to fashion. So you're asking two very complicated, different questions. I think the positionality of Israel geopolitically, what it represents, traditionally as the only quote unquote democracy within the Middle East. The U.S. Deciding early on in its emergence after the was allowed to become a state um, that the U.S. would stand behind the cause of the Israelis, and the Soviet Union choosing the side of the Palestinians. And so, if you're asking, for example, where the tendency of the left to side with the Palestinian cause, the Arab cause, that's been there um, from within that history, those alliances, those geopolitical allegiances were made. If you're talking about anti-Semitism, regardless of these geopolitical struggles and the role that Israel plays in the Middle East in terms of political and socioeconomical power within the culture of Christianity, within the culture of Islam, you have a certain amount of anti-Semitism, and so we also are um, working within those ideological battles so that the people on the ground, regardless of their understanding of the geopolitical struggles, have inherited from within those cultural religious traditions centuries of anti-Semitism that are then easily manipulated by political figures as the way to further their own causes.
What's interesting, though, is that at the same time that the Jewish people were expelled from Spain, you also got the Catholics expelled the Muslims from southern Spain and El
Absolutely.
Cid, the whole Ed Cid thing. So, I don't know. This is sort of a naive question, but why don't instead of Jews and Muslims fighting each other, why don't they just gang up on Christians? I mean, that's who kicked them out everywhere, and so it's kind of maybe human beings are much more complex than that, obviously, but
No, there have been times absolutely within Muslim, controlled um, governments. So, within Spain, for example, in the 12th century, the Jews did quite well. The Muslim countries have not always gone after the Jewish communities. That's actually, that's something that I also have to teach my students. They tend to think Jew versus Arab. That's first of all, they're Jewish Arabs. Second of all, there have been many times, and also within Spain's history, that the Jews actually fared better under Muslim governments than Christian governments.
yeah, it's sort of interesting because I think that we have a tendency to see Muslims as Arabs, and yet Palestinians are actually different than Iranians and Bedouins and the rest. So there's all these multiple nationalities. And so, which takes me, I'm going to give Gene a chance to get into this thing, and which takes me, what's really happening here? I mean, is it really about religion? Or is religion being used? And what it's really about is this yearning. I was reading someplace that there seems to be, well, like Hillary Clinton in some interview said, really, there's a kind of yearning for totalitarianism.
Well, going to the conflict in Gaza, the Hamas and the other entities that form the axis of resistance say that they initiated this because of what happened almost a year and a half ago in Al Aqsa Mosque. And every time Al Aqsa is affected in Jerusalem, it seems to be an intifada or an uprising of some sort, an aggression. And certainly the three monotheistic religions have much in common. But what they have most of all in common when it comes to conflict is a belief that God is on their side. So God wills it was the battle cry of the Crusaders. Conquest is the confirmation for Islam that God wants them to control something. And for Jews, if you go back to the Torah 3,000 years ago, you see that God promised the land to the Jews. So these three related religions, the eldest brother of which, we're back to three brothers again, is Judaism, all believe that God is behind their initiatives. And the way that Hamas describes this war is they call it the Al-Aqsa flood or the Al-Aqsa storm. So while the world is looking at this from much more pragmatic reasons, such as power, military, um, history, and all of that, there is a religious underbelly to this because, in terms of personal group identity, you need a religious foundational myth. And those that do not subscribe to this religious foundational myth are constructed as the other. When you have a construction of the other, you have potential for dehumanization. And dehumanization must precede violence in terms of group wars. So we see.
So taking this back into Russia and Putin. When Stalin was in control, the mantra in Russia was that, and this is really, really, short, and getting to it, but it was something along the lines that religion was the opium of the masses. That if anything, we ought to get rid of it. And then you get to Putin takes over the country, and one of the first things he does is he immediately makes peace with the Russian Orthodox Church, which which existed, by the way, even during the Stalinist era, and but it's sort of state religion, and they start to prosecute gays and the rest of it, and then he invades the Ukraine, and there's a split in Orthodoxy. So it's not only between Jews and Muslims and everything. It's actually Christians are having their field day as well, right? I don't. How much does that play into the Ukrainian conflict?
Religio is the root word of religion. Religio means to bind. If you're going to have control over a population and you become the father figure and the leader, you need a binding force. And what brings people together is their desire to belong. We all have a kind of an atavistic desire to be in a group because evolutionarily, that's how we defended ourselves against other species. So theorists in social psychology state that this need to belong engaged in groups with identities, with a common philosophy or religion binding them together, can contribute to social stability. But the price of social stability may be aggression against the other, whom the group feels is encroaching on its territory, its culture, its identity, and its interests.
Well, Carl, coming back to the United States, we see reports now of, and in my opinion, that appears to be affected by what's happening in the Ukraine and what's happening in Israel, and that is that this whole theme of nationalism. And it used to be that to be a patriot in the United States was to be and to be anti-Russian. And yet, the so-called supreme patriots, the real right-wing types that you would expect in years past to be anti-Russian. I mean, it was almost like a mantra of the conservatives that you had to be anti-Russian, and there's a growing movement in conservatism that is now saying that you have to be anti all of these things. I'm anti anti, well, on the social values, but there seems to be anti-Semitic tendencies, anti-Muslim tendencies, in if affecting our politics. How does that play with all of these conflicts?
Yeah, I mean, this is really a question for Gene, but I'll take my stab at it. I mean, because I think what Gene is talking about is this process of othering, and clearly, in the 1950s, as you suggest, McCarthyism was a real thing, and it was very much an anti-communist sort of movement. But what's happened in the United States is, like in much of the rest of the world, is it's not really about an ideology anymore as much as it is a form of nationalism. And I think in the United States, what's really being developed in this nationalism is an anti-globalism. And so it's not so much the other has become the globalists of the world. So when you listen to some of the rhetoric coming from the far right, it's really the anti-globalist that is the anti-globalist aspect of it that is becoming the more important element. So it's really a matter of othering, but it's the globalist has sort of been the recipient of the nationalist ire, I think, in the United States.
Well, it seems interesting, though, Carl, and since you're an advisor to the Pacific Forum, it seems very interesting that many of the same people that are starting to, in a sense, get soft on Russia seem to have picked up that same kind of intensity that they used to have against Russia are now being applied on China.
Mhm.
And how much of that, and that you can't, I don't see that as necessarily having religious roots like some of these other conflicts that we talked about.
Yeah.
How much of that is racial?
I don't know. I don't know how much of it is racial. I think I think in my mind there's a tendency to overthink the racist aspect of it. I think in the case of China, to shift completely to the other side of the world, I think that the in the United States, the dissatisfaction with China is that China sort of beat the United States at its own game in globalism, where China has developed a much stronger economy than the United States thought was possible. And so, I think that there's a bit of a backlash. It's a globalist backlash, but it's against China because they see China as the threat to American hegemony, both in the region as well as in the economy. And so I think that's where the the nationalist aspect of the United States interacts with China. It's not, as you say, it's not really religion as much as it is something that the United States sees itself as losing its hegemonic position in the global economy, and it sees China as the reason for that happening. And so, in this case, I don't think it is about religion, and I don't really see it so much as a racist thing as a state to state, geopolitical sort of thing.
We jumped in the beginning anyway. The U.S. jumped into to back up the Ukraine, and when Russia invaded Ukraine. How serious are we to do the same thing? And what's the prognosis if China was to invade Taiwan?
I guess I'll take that question. Um, I mean, it's a leading question because first you have to believe that China is going to attack Taiwan, and in my view, I think China is reluctant to do that because it sees the problem with trying to take China or take Taiwan by force. I don't think China is to the point where it sees it to its advantage to take Taiwan by force. I think it much more is inclined to wait Taiwan out. That it sees the United States and Japan as unable to ultimately defend Taiwan, and that its overwhelming presence in the region and its growing dominance in the region will force Taiwan into a subservient, at least economically subservient position to China, where it becomes a matter of Taiwan accepting China as the hegemon in the region, and therefore acquiescing to its demands for recognition of Chinese sovereignty.
Which kind of makes the situation interesting in the sense that it makes Putin even sound more irrational than he appears to be. I mean, why would you attack Ukraine, given the fact that you would get the kind of resistance that you now have? And so
well, I think
bigger...
Putin was pretty surprised that he got the resistance he got. Remember, I think Putin, it was certainly a strategic blunder on his part to think that he was going to drive tanks into Kiev and take over Ukraine when this war started. So I think that was a misreading on his part.
Would Romati, would Israel be able to even exist without the support of the Western powers, given the widespread opposition they seem to face in the Middle East?
Right. It's the anti-Israel rhetoric is so strong, and the domination and the readiness of every antagonistic country to jump onto Israel and wipe it off the map. Every statement that comes out of political leaders at the helm is to wipe Israel off the map, and this kind of aggression that Israel has to face would not have been they would not have been able to resist this if we did not have support of the Western allies and US in particular. And these regional conflicts do have global implications. Now, this religion, what we talked about, Mount Mosque, Alaska Mosque, it was Temple Mount before, a religious place for the Jews. Now, when you convert it into a religious place for Muslims, the third most holiest site for Muslims, there is a regional religious tension, and that religious tension leads to land conflict, this that. But this global implication will be when these people migrate outside, they come to democratic societies like Europe and America, and they dominate or implement their religion, their culture onto a democratic society which does not want to accept them. And that that kind of tension would lead to more conflict, resistance in democratic societies. So these two regional conflicts are going to have terrible repercussions on the global society in a few years' time. So,
Daphne, what happens if Israel wipes out Hamas? I mean, does that stop anything, or do we just have another group popping up?
I don't actually think Israel will wipe out Hamas. I'm not sure that's possible. But I think what I would say is that what's worrying about what's happening in Ukraine and what's worrying about this particular attack by Hamas on Israel is the dehumanization that's involved, so that we have across all civilizations an agreement that we protect children, we protect the elderly, and so and we do not use sexual violence against women in negotiating conflicts. When you have civilians brought into the conflict in this way, through terroristic means, and you have the kind of aggression that we see in Ukraine, we're seeing a heightened tolerance for dehumanization. That's what's more worrying, really, to me, is that it's not so much the anti-Israel rhetoric, which we've heard before, but it is the lack of shock and dismay at the dehumanization taking place currently in Ukraine, and that took place in Israel, where our common sense of humanity should bind us together So this is another way of thinking about religion. Our common sense of humanity should bind us together, regardless of ideological. If I could just finish, regardless of our ideological positionings, to express outrage at the murder of babies, the kidnapping of children, kidnapping of elderly, and of Russia's aggression towards Ukrainian people. So this is where the humanitarian response and a sense of ourselves as ethical actors on the global stage is where we need to begin to find hope and resilience and collaboration rather than sinking into a kind of despair over the ways in which we are divided.
You know, I think that's a great capsulization of what, what's of the discussion and where we are. We're the good guys, we think anyway. I mean, we're on the right side in Ukraine, we're on the right side in Israel, and yet we seem to see the world in a way uniting against us, which was described by Carl. The idea of a new alliances and they seem to have one thing in common, because it's, we've talked about religion, but it really isn't religion, because half of Russia that's threatening Ukraine is Muslim, for example. But it seems to be this thing about totalitarianism. I mean, like people seem to, well, it just seemed that they want something more than democracy, or different than democracy. We got about a minute. Anybody can grab it wherever we are and go for it. How much of this is, how much of a symptom are the Ukrainian situation and what's happening in Israel, and how much of it is the cause of where we find ourselves as a country? Does anybody want to try that?
Well, totalitarianism is on the rise. Neo-fascism is on the rise. The type of military conflict on the ground, even the use of drones, which imitates the kamikaze campaign by the weaker Japanese entity in World War II, all brings back the prodrome to World War II. And I do believe we are in a third world war right now, which is a hybrid war. It's fought with different weapons, but there is extreme polarization between, as Carl has explained to us. And this is well within the philosophy of Russia and its alliance with China. At this time, they would like to win without losing too much. So they're using other means, space, threats, narratives, propaganda, psyops.
Thank you. I was hoping to end this program with sort of upbeat, but it's difficult to do. So I'm actually going to give each of you a chance to say a few words, and we're going to run slightly over time. But Romati, any last comments about our discussion?
I just hope that they differentiate between Putin's aggression in Ukraine and Israel's right for self-defense against terrorism in straight terms, rather than equating both of them as aggression of countries. That's the only.
Thank you. Carl, anything?
Yeah, I'll say real quickly. I think, Daphne brings up the issue of a humanitarian approach. And I think it's important that we remember that the humanitarian approach is really where we should be binding ourselves into a common theme. Is we need to think about a humanitarian answer to conflict.
Daphne, you got the last word.
Well, in the face of effective polarization, emotional polarization, which tends to create conflict and has us emphasizing conflict, our best weapon against that is our common humanity. And so I will end on that note. That's where my hope lies, and that's where my efforts lie as someone in the humanities, someone who studies the humanities, is to find the common ground and the good in each culture, in each religion, in each nation, that we have a commonality that values life, and that protects the innocent and defends those who cannot defend themselves. And we all know that to be true. And we need to depend on our senses of what is right and what is good in times of conflict, and not be manipulated by an attempt to polarize along and divide along these manufactured conflicts that have to do with identity and ideology. So I tend to be hopeful.
Thank you. And thank all of you. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Romati. Thank you, Carl. And thank you, Daphne, for a very, very intense discussion this noon. We appreciate you joining us, and we appreciate all of the people who sent in 100+ questions, by the way. And and thank you for listening. And we look forward to further discussions in the future. Aloha, everybody. Mahalo for joining us.